Welcome to the Home Birth After Cesarean podcast. Due to the rate of unnecessary C-sections, the lack of support, and limited options for VBAC moms in the hospital, more and more women are choosing to have their VBAC babies at home. This podcast was created for women to share and listen to stories of home birth after cesarean. I'm your host, Rachel Garrett. Today we're chatting with Linda. So Linda, if you just want to give us a little bit of an introduction to who you are, that would be great.
Yeah, I'm Linda. I'm 34 years old and I'm now a stay-at-home mom. I have 4 little kids. I have a 7-year-old daughter, a 4-year-old son, and a 2-year-old daughter, and a new little baby. She's just 2 months old. And I now stay at home with them, but I earned my PhD in chemistry, so I was teaching college. And I left that when my second was born. So I did a little bit of work. Actually, my daughter got to go with me, which was pretty awesome. And so now I live in the Kansas City metro area with my husband, and he's currently working from home as a software engineer, which has been a big blessing for COVID because this whole pregnancy he was home for. So that was a nice little surprise in the craziness of the pandemic. So
Yeah, definitely. And I've heard that from a lot of people. It's been nice to have that extra support around if people have been able to work from home or be home a little bit more with all of the virtual options these days. So that makes a difference sometimes.
Yeah. And when you're like really sick and, they can help get lunch for the kids or whatever
Right.
that
You had
was.
3 other kids to worry about.
that was nice. Right. Yeah. It gets a little bit harder and that, you just learn to juggle and enjoy the chaos of motherhood. So
Definitely. Well, take us back to that first pregnancy that you had with your oldest kiddo.
So my husband and I got married in April of 2012, and we knew pretty quickly we wanted to start trying or just kind of let's see what happens. I wouldn't say it was actively trying from the first cycle, but we got pregnant in September with our first, and we knew that I had low progesterone. So I had to go in right away to make sure that I didn't have a miscarriage and make sure my levels were great. So that started off well, but I think because I had those low progesterones, it just kind of assumed care with the OB that I was already established with. I didn't search around and say, oh, this is a good OB to have, or I didn't really question any of that. It was just like, this is what we did. And it was fine. The doctor was good. I feel like it was a pretty standard prenatal care. But the one exception is I had HG. So I was struggling to keep anything down. I think I was throwing up 50 to 100 times a day for about the first 22 weeks. I was on max Zolfran and Reglan at the same time. I would go down on the weekends to visit family and get IV fusions down there because my OB, I just don't think he understood how bad it was, and maybe I never conveyed it because I was still working. Like, I was teaching college at the time. I had to leave my class 3 or 4 times in a 50-minute lecture to go throw up. Like,
Oh my goodness.
it was rough, but I didn't know any different. It was my first pregnancy, so I just kind of sucked it up and went on. And so when we were getting towards the end of pregnancy, I wasn't getting as sick as often, but I was still working out every day. I was, trying to be as healthy as I can, very conscientious of what I was eating. But I noticed around 26 weeks that baby still seemed like we didn't know the sex at the time, that she was head down. And so it was something I had started questioning. And I brought it up to my OB around 32 weeks. And I was like, hey, I don't think my baby's head down. Oh, there's plenty of time for that. Plenty of time. Okay, great. And so this went on like every single appointment that I questioned. I was like, I don't think my baby's head down. And I finally got to the 36-week appointment, and we had a very long discussion about external version and all the things needed to do if I had a breech baby, like what my options were. At that time, my OB still didn't think my baby was breech, and just kind of got the patronizing, you're a first time mom, you're just stressing about nothing for nothing's sake, and I go in for my 38-week appointment, and I went by myself that time. Again, I brought it up. It was the first time he had done an internal exam to see how far I was dilated, and I was like, I really don't think this baby's head down. And again, it was kind of like the same thing, like baby's vertex. There's like this is baby's head down here, not, and I remember leaving that appointment, and I just felt so disheartened by like the lack of the doctor trusting me and maternal intuition. And so when I was talking to my husband, he was like, well, I'll just come to the 39-week appointment. I'll make sure you get an ultrasound if you think baby's still not head down. So at first I was relieved, and then I was kind of upset. I was like, I need my husband, a man, to come in here and like kind of lay down the law. So I was pretty frustrated, but I was like, okay, I don't want to be the crazy first time mom demanding all the tests. And little did I know that I would go into labor 3 days later. And so we never had that ultrasound. We had done the Bradley method in terms of like prepping. So my husband and I had every intention of doing things as natural as possible. So I didn't sign C-section consent. I was not going to do an IV lock. I was going to basically try to go in more or less like right before I needed to push. Like that was the game plan, and with all things birth, they're very predictable. So that was the plan. And we were both, on the same page. And then the night I went into labor, well, it was kind of the afternoon, I decided that I needed to mow the lawn because I wanted to make sure that we had a freshly mowed lawn when I came home.
So you were in labor when you decided you wanted to mow the lawn, or right before?
No, it was early labor. I didn't know it at the time, but I was like, these are a little heavier than Braxton Hicks. But so yeah, 9 months pregnant, mowing the lawn in June. It's just it was good. I come in and I'm timing my contractions. They're about 7 minutes apart. So I'm like, okay, like probably should relax a little bit. But my husband had a frisbee like pickup game at the park, and I always went with him because I would walk laps. And normally I'd walk anywhere from 2 to 3 miles. I think I walked like a half a mile that day, and I was like,
you were probably tired from mowing the lawn.
Right. I was like, I can't do this. Like, I don't know what my problem was. And I was just convinced I was going to 41 weeks. And so I was 39 plus 2 days at this point, and I was like, I'm not in labor. Like, I'm not in labor. And I actually even joked with a couple people. I'm like, see you next week. I'll still be pregnant, like. So we leave, and we decided to go get milkshakes because it was really hot outside, and it was kind of nice. It was just a little date with my husband, and we get home, and I was like, okay, I should probably go to bed soon in case I really am in labor. And at this point, I'm timing contractions, and they're 5 minutes apart, and I don't know why I'm thinking like I'm not in labor, but I was still convinced I was 2 weeks away. So I go to bed like at 9:30, or at least lay down, and then about 11 o'clock, I get up, and I'm like, okay, I'm kind of like you. I can't lay down when I'm in labor. Like the contractions, like for me, I need to be up on a birthing ball or showering or something. And so my husband then realizes he doesn't have his power cord for his laptop, which is at work. So we drive to his work at 11 o'clock at night to go get his power cord. So I decide to stay in the lobby, and he goes up in the elevators to go grab his power cord. And the security guard comes in, and he's looking at me, and he's like, oh dear God, lady, please don't have this baby on the floor, because my contractions are 5 minutes apart. Like I'm having to work for these contractions at this point. And you could just see his face, and I was like, we need to get out of here. I think we're going to give him a panic attack. So we leave and we get back home. So I encouraged my husband to go to bed because I didn't know, how long this was going to take, and kind of did all the things that I could think of. I showered. I was sitting on the birthing ball, sitting on the toilet backwards, just trying to labor. And about 2:30, 3 o'clock, I wake him up, and I was having intense back labor at this point. So I needed the counter pressure. So he got up and helped, and just jammed his hands or his feet in my back every contraction. So he was always right there with me. And about it was about 5:30 in the morning. We start kind of like, all right, contractions are less than 4 minutes apart, over a minute long. We should probably start thinking about getting to the hospital. And it was about a 30-minute drive. And we passed like 7 hospitals on the way to our hospital, which is always fun. My husband decided that he needed to get some McDonald's on the way because he was hungry. And I felt really bad for him because then the car smelled like McDonald's. And then I'm throwing up on the way to the hospital. So it was just charming.
Was there a reason you chose that specific hospital? You said you passed a couple on the way and that one was there.
Partly that's just because where my OB was. So because I had the low progesterone, I needed a doctor who would monitor low progesterone. And I know that it's crazy, but it's still like controversial to a lot of OBs. So that's where he was. That's where I went. But
Gotcha.
it wasn't like, oh, this is the best hospital. It was just like, oh, that's where my doctor's at. So we go, and I'm scared to death of the like can't eat or drink in labor, or all those silly hospital protocols that are not meant for laboring women. So I chucked like 64 ounces of Gatorade in this 30-minute drive. So by the time we get to the hospital, which the main doors of the hospital still weren't open yet, so we had to go through the ER, and I have to go to the bathroom. Like, I'm pregnant. Like, I mean, you can hold your like urine for a few minutes when you're pregnant, and then you just drink all this Gatorade. So I'm like having contractions, trying to get signed in. The lady is just not very, I was like, can I just go to the bathroom? And they're like, nope, you can't go to the bathroom down here because you're going to have a baby on my floor. And I was like, do you want me just to pee on the floor? Like, I need to go to the bathroom. So it took about 10 minutes before we walked into the ER to get up to labor and delivery and, get all checked in. And by then it's about 6:10, 6:15. And they checked me and I was only 4 centimeters. And I was so defeated, not because I was only 4, because we came to the hospital and I was only 4. It was like, well, apparently I'm not as close as I thought I would be. And I had already been in labor for over 12 hours at that point. So it was disappointing, but they're like, well, we might keep you. And then that was the other thing. And I'm like, my contractions are like 3 minutes apart at this point. Like, how is this like seemed like there was this really big disconnect. And so my husband and I were kind of just left in our room to labor. We didn't have a doula. The nurse that we ended up getting was awesome. She actually only does natural births in the hospital. That's like her thing. And so we were very fortunate to have such a strong presence to help us. And so she was able to get us like a birthing ball and a peanut ball, and she really helped try to optimize the different positions. And so we did that for a while. Around 9 a.m., my mother-in-law showed up, and not too long after that, my mother showed up as well. And it was nice, but then it was just like more people in the room, and it just kind of disrupts your concentration for the actual like thinking and breathing through contractions. But at like 9:30, they checked me and I was 9 centimeters. So I'm like, all right, okay, we're going strong. Like, baby will be here soon. I made the mistake of looking at the clock. Don't ever look at the clock when you're in labor. And so I continued laboring around 11, I think it was. I wanted to push. And so the nurse was like, all right, well, I need to check you. So she checked and I was like 9 plus. And she's like, you can't push yet. And I was like, okay. So that's really hard to not push when your body wants to, but at the same time, I knew I hadn't slept at all. I was like, I need to make sure that I have enough energy. So I'm trying my best to listen to my nurse. And, I really trusted her that she knew what she was doing. And I labored for another 2 hours like that. And I think she checked me every 15, 30 minutes because I still wanted to push. I had all the pressure too. And finally, she looked me in the eyes. She said, Linda, I think it's time we break your water. And I was like, no, 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 no. Like, we're not doing this. And I had put her off probably for about 30 minutes. And she's like, I'm not telling you this lightly, but maybe that'll just give you enough to like get that cervical lip to disappear so you can start pushing. And so finally I was like, fine. So actually around 1 o'clock, I noticed like my hands and face were going numb. And so I asked for oxygen and they're like, your O2 stats are fine. Like you don't need oxygen. But I think I just needed something to focus on. So I put an oxygen mask on and I still was like, I really wanted to push. And then my nurse is like, you're in transition. You're so close. Like just just a little bit longer, one contraction at a time. So I was trying really hard to focus on that. And then she's like, okay, let me check you again. And maybe you can push now. And so she checked me. And then you just see her face, like all of a sudden was like ash white. And I was like, what happened? And then the next contraction hit me. So I was like focused on that. And then all of a sudden there was like 20 people in my room. But the nurse was like, I'm not sure if I feel baby's furrowing and the eyebrow or a butt crack. And I was like, what? So my OB ran to go get the ultrasound. And they checked and baby was not vertex like I had been told multiple times. Baby was in fact frank breech. And because she was so far engaged, all of a sudden they were afraid that she was going to get stuck. And they're like, oh, that makes sense why you've been at 9 centimeters for the last 4 or 5 hours. And so I had to be willed for an emergency C-section. I'm not sure if, I know my OB doesn't deliver breech babies, but I'm not sure if it was like hospital policies. A lot of hospitals won't allow it anymore. But I mean, I didn't have an IV lock. I had no consent. So like the nurse like jumped up on my bed and she's like putting an IV lock as we're going to the OR. I had a lot of choice words for my OB at that moment. And so, but he's like promised me, and he's like, you can VBAC, you did great, you'll be fine. He's like, I'll take my time and stitch you really well. And, but I was just angry. I was angry that I had asked so many times for weeks, just like the movement of my baby didn't make sense to be vertex. So we get to the OR, and my husband, when he got wheeled in, he wasn't in there because he had to go get scrubbed in. And so, we're talking to the anesthesiologist is asking me all these questions. Well, not too many times you have a laboring mom who is doing it completely natural, ends up with a C-section. That's much more rare. So they are like, why can't you concentrate? I was like, I can still feel everything. Like I'm still having contractions. And so I think once they realized that, my OB was like, Linda, you have 3 more contractions. And then I was counting out loud, let him know that I still felt that 4th one. And then by then my husband was able to come in, and my mom. And so she was able to take pictures, which was, I think you remember, like as a blessing to have those pictures, because it's kind of just a blur. But yeah, so I had the C-section. Everything was normal, standard, nothing of great significance. It had to be fast because my body was pushing, and they actually had to check before they started the incision to see if I delivered the baby, because all of a sudden the baby dropped. But she was not. She was born via C-section, about 19 hours of total labor. So when they pulled her out, the OB made a joke about her siblings calling her a butthead because she was frank breech. And I was like, it's probably not the most appropriate thing to say right after I have a baby. So, and then he forgot to show her to me. She was sent away to the nurses. There was no concern. And I get some moms don't get to see their baby right away because there's significant concerns for the baby. That wasn't the case for me. They just forgot. So the baby was taken and she was kind of moved to the other side of the OR where they bathed her, weighed her, hatted her, wrapped her up in a burrito, and everybody, including my husband and my mom, everyone's talking about how cute she is and how little she is. And I'm having a conversation with my OB about the shape of my uterus. Like, I'm just like, this is so backwards. Like, I saw a picture of my baby before I saw my baby, and I was like, that's just not right. And so I was still pretty livid that I had to have the C-section. So my negative emotions hadn't left yet. Obviously, I was like really excited that I had my baby, but I didn't even see her. So that there was still kind of that like disconnect, at least from my perspective. So while there's all this gooing and cooing over by the nurses, my husband or my OB and I are talking about, the shape of my uterus, whether I have endometriosis. I was like, hey, since you're in there, you can check, right? And the answer is no. But then like one of the most vivid memories of the OR is them counting, because they use all the gauze. They have to count every single thing to make sure nothing gets left behind. And so I remember just listening to the nurses count, and they had to recount like 4 times because they did lose one, not in me, it was on the floor. But it was just one of those things that I was just like, oh, this is what I remember from our birth. And so right before we leave the OR, they hand her to me, and I was just like, I got her and I'm like trying to pull the blankets off her, or I ripped her hat off. I think that ended up on the floor, and they're kind of like, what are you doing? It's like, I need my baby on me, and so it just, I don't know if that hospital's gotten any better about normal, C-section protocol and skin to skin, but yeah, it was 30 minutes from when she was born to when I even saw her, and there was zero concern at all for her well-being. Like, so we get back to the room, and I wanted to immediately try to nurse, and then so they had lactation consultant come in, and she was like, oh, sweetheart, you're a first-time mom. You just had a C-section. Your baby's going to need formula. Like, she's a lactation consultant. And that's what she told me. Like, how I blew my mind. And so I tried to get my baby to latch, and it didn't work. And I still had my really awesome nurse. So she like is holding the baby and trying to like calm me down, but I'm crying because I had the C-section. And finally she's like, how about we just pump to see, I think it was just not that I needed to pump or anything, but just something to do and something for me to mentally focus on. And then because they had to take the baby back to the nursery, like I don't even understand like why she left. Like I don't know. So anyways, I pump, and the nurse came and helped me get set up, and the lactation consultant came back in, and she's like, oh honey, you're not going to get anything. And I'm like,
that is so dismissive. Wow.
It serves no purpose. And a lot of women, when they pump the first time, especially within an hour of delivering, you're not going to get nothing more than a couple drops. Like that's true, but she could have presented it in a much more beneficial way.
A supportive way.
Right. So I ended up pumping, and they give you those like, I don't know, 1/2 ounce collector cups or something for the colostrum. Like, and all of a sudden I was like, oh, I think they're full, because my nurse had put a warm blanket like all the way across my chest. I think 1, to not look, and 2, to just like, again, her whole reason for me pumping was just to like focus and decompress. And so, but sure enough, I had filled up those little cups, and I was pumping colostrum just like in my lap. And the lactation consultant she like didn't believe her. So my nurse went and like paraded like my little like, half ounce colostrum like around to the nurse's station, like, look what my patient did. And so that made me feel a little bit better. I was like,
Yeah,
okay,
hopefully that stops her in her tracks a little bit and she doesn't do that
right.
to
I was
another new mom.
like, why would you do that? So I mean, and nursing was very rocky for us. I just really struggled with latching and just the pain of a C-section, trying to position your baby correctly. But we got there eventually. It ended up being okay. But yes, it just wasn't the most supportive atmosphere. I left the hospital actually like 40 hours later because I was like, I'm done with this. Like, I'm done with people coming in. I had not my OB, but the assistant or his partner came in, and she was a female. And I think that just gave her the right to like do whatever she wanted without asking. Like, she like came in and like ripped down my sheets and like pulled back my gown and like inspecting my C-section scar. Like, she didn't ask. She didn't say, hey, this is what I'm gonna do. Like, I had no idea what was going on. And then she just like ripped off the bandage, like, no warning, no. And I was just like, wow, like, I'm a human. Like, a little bit of dignity and respect would go a long ways here. And so not too long after that, I would say probably about 2 weeks, I really started struggling with postpartum anxiety. I didn't have the depressive side. I cried a lot, but it wasn't depressive. It was double checking, triple checking locks, just being paranoid, having intrusive thoughts. I think a lot of it was related to my birth. I just wasn't, there was just no healing in that. And so I got a couple of progesterone injections according to the NAPRO protocol for postpartum depression and anxiety. And it did tremendously help. But I had a nurse that told me I could only get them every like 2 months. Well, it was supposed to be every 2 days. And so when I thought I had to wait months before I get another one, I was obviously already back into the anxiety cycle. So it was a rough go. I was finishing up my dissertation at the time. My daughter did come with me, which I think was a blessing to always have her near me. But I remember it probably wasn't until like 10 months postpartum after she was born. I got several progesterone shots in a row after I figured out it was 2 days and not 2 months. And it was the first time that I recognized like my daughter as my daughter. Before it was just like, oh, this baby that I'm feeding, or oh, this baby that I'm taking care of. And she had her physical needs met, but she didn't have like that emotional connection from me. And so that was like a big jump for me in parenthood and motherhood, of like how to emotionally connect with your child. I'd never thought that would be a problem. But, I had all these friends that are like, oh, isn't it love at first sight? And I'm like, no, it's not. Like, it's like these babies are a lot of work, and they don't, there's not a lot back in terms of emotion or affirmation. So that was something I really struggled with, that I didn't expect, I guess, going into motherhood.
What kind of support did you have for you during that time? Or is there anything that you wish you would have had that you didn't?
I think the big thing, I actually think I was like, had a cry out for help for a long time, and people were dismissive of it. And not because they didn't care. It's just, I remember being like, Mom, I'm crying a lot. And she's like, oh, honey, it's hard. Like, it's hard. Like, you got the baby blues. Like, you'll be okay. And my mother-in-law said something similar. My husband, God love him, he's not in the details of life. And so he's like, oh, really? You're struggling? And I'm like, but a lot of it is he would fall asleep, and then I would go and double and check the locks. And I did like pacing at night. And a lot of it was when he was asleep. And so, you have that sleep deprivation mixed with anxiety. It's kind of a recipe for disaster.
And I think kind of what you said too, like we just live in a culture where it's expected, like those first couple weeks or months, it's just going to be hard. Like
Mm-hmm.
that's just what it is, being a new mom, or even if you're not a brand new first time mom, having other
Right.
kids at home, you're just kind of expected to pick up the slack and just keep on keeping on when, yes, that is part of motherhood. You're sleep deprived and you're hormonal and you're bleeding and you're expected to take care of this brand new little baby. But with all those other things on top of it, it's a lot more than just trying to adjust to taking care of a new baby.
Exactly. Yeah, it was well past the like this is an acceptable level of hard. It was, but and maybe I personally didn't do enough work on conveying how hard it was for me. But I'm also one of those people that are generally, well, this is life, so we got to suck it up and keep going, And so I was still working on my dissertation. I was still, like I didn't stop life. And looking back, I wish I would have. I would have said, no, I need to take a semester off from school, or no, I need to start counseling, or whatever it was. But I also think I made a lot of little excuses too. I'm like, oh, well, when the baby weight's gone, I'll feel better, or if I get more vitamin D, or if I just eat healthier, or if I get a good night's sleep, which was not going to happen, that I would be okay, And so some of those things where other people were telling me, oh, just, like eat a salad for lunch or go for a run, which is great because those things do help you, in small increments. But when there is a bigger underlying issue, that needs to be addressed. And diet and regular exercise is not going to correct that, at least in the short term, for sure. So I get to the summer. I decided to take that summer off from work because I had finally realized I'm like, I need some breathing space. So I took it off, and it was good to have that break from work and from school. And then not too long after that, we decided to go ahead and put my daughter in daycare. So we did that. As most moms will tell you, is completely nerve-wracking. And so I went back to school to try to finish things up, and I started teaching again as well. I was teaching, I think, nursing chemistry at the time. And it was good because it gave me a purpose. Like I felt like the anxiety was better at that point, and school was getting closer to being done. So it was like the light at the end of the tunnel. And then not too long after, maybe like Christmas, we were like, okay, well, our baby's like 18 months old at this point. Like we should start thinking about having another one, because and I was feeling really good. So we started talking it, but I hadn't cycled yet. And so I went in, just to kind of ask, not my OB, but just my family practice doctor, like, is there anything I can do to help facilitate this? And then he gave me a PCOS diagnosis because I wasn't cycling. But I was still nursing like 10 times a day, and my baby was in the 1 percentile. And every time I tried to take out a nursing session, she lost weight. So in hindsight, was probably not the best time to get pregnant. So not too long after that, he was like, okay, well, you need to do Clomid. You need to do this. You need to do this. And we kind of put it off for about 3 months. And then we're like, oh no, like, okay, let's try Clomid. Why not? So the first month we tried Clomid, and then I also did HCG injections. We got pregnant with twins. So that was a little shocking. And so during this time, this was the summer, I was supposed to defend my PhD in May. And for some crazy reasons, like our state had went on strike, so the faculty couldn't be on campus. So I didn't get to defend my PhD in May. It got pushed back to July. So we got pregnant at the beginning of June, kind of thinking, oh, I'd be done. So I find out that I'm pregnant with these twins, and I decided to go ahead and go back to my regular, the OB that I had before. He was very supportive on VBAC, and I was like, okay, this just makes sense. So I go in for my ultrasound, and they noticed that one baby had a heartbeat, and one baby, they were like, you're right on the cusp, like, once you come back in a few days, and we'll make sure that that baby has a heartbeat too. So we came back to do another early ultrasound, and the second baby didn't have a heartbeat. And this is Monday. I'm defending my PhD that Friday. So it was like kind of a loaded week, because I just find out that it's the medical terminology is a vanishing twin. So we got pregnant with 2, but we get placed with this nurse, and she was probably the most uncompassionate person that I've ever had. Like, just trying to digest, a losing one baby but still having one baby. And like, there is a sense of relief, like, okay, I'm not having twins, because there's that freak out when you find out you're having twins. But then you're sad because you lost one of your babies, and she's just like, oh, it's fine, honey. And then she was like mad about a lot of different things. And my husband and I were just like looking at each other. We're like, this is just, what is wrong? And we leave the appointment, and he's like, I want to go back in there and report that nurse. Like, it was 100% unacceptable how we were treated. And I'm just like, I was just emotionally spent. I'm like, you know what? We all have bad days. Like, she really must be having a bad day if that's the way she's going to treat somebody, And so I'm just like, I'm going to let it go. So I defend my PhD on Friday. I actually started throwing up that morning. And so my boss is like, oh, are you really nervous? And I'm like, well, that's one reason why people throw up. So we got through that, which was great, because then I was like, okay, I'm going to take the semester, or I wasn't going to teach that fall in case I had HG again, because there was no way that I was going to be able to teach, or I didn't want to teach while doing that. I get a letter in the mail saying that I am no longer a patient at that practice, because this nurse reported my husband and I as abusive, which, like, the whole situation was like so crazy. And at that point, we had already been looking elsewhere. We started looking at like a freestanding birth clinic, and I was starting to like, hey, maybe the situation isn't the best. Like, this nurse wasn't supportive. Like, so at that point, I had requested my medical records from that practice. And I'm reading through them, and I noticed nowhere, not one time did it mention that I thought my baby was breech. So even though I had brought it up with my OB at least 6 times, there is not one mention of a concern ever. And I was really frustrated by that, because I was like, that was my biggest concern. And I brought it up over and over and over again. So I'm like, are you really getting good prenatal care if you report stuff to the nurse and talk about it with the doctor, but nothing's getting reported? Like, there's just too many people like that's providing care, and it's not, consistent care. And so we quickly had to find another practice, and I reached out to ICANN, which we have a very active local chapter here in Kansas City, to find out, okay, who's the best VBAC doctor? So I started there, and I started interviewing VBAC doctors and VBAC midwives. Like, I didn't even know midwives existed in our country. Like, I'll be honest, I had no idea. And so, but the ones that I've interviewed at the hospital just was like, I didn't get warm and fuzzies. Like, they're kind of just an extension of the OB, and it was, they really weren't providing better care. It was just like, oh, if you're low risk, you could have a midwife. And almost every practice, there was no, like, if you went into labor, there was no guarantee you're going to have your OB. And I just, I don't know, like, that just didn't sit well with me. And the freestanding birth clinic, they had 8 midwives. But again, it was like, no strangers at your birth. So you're going to have all these different midwives, and whoever's on call is going to deliver your baby. And I'm like, that may work for some moms. That does not work for me. Again, because I felt like there was such a disconnect just with the nurse and the doctor. I'm like, I can't imagine like 8 different midwives. And so at that point, I started looking into the home birth world, which is something I never thought I would do. I mean, I have a PhD in chemistry. I believe in science. Like, people birth your babies in hospitals because it's the safest place. Like, it just was not something that was on my radar at all. But the more people I interviewed, the more I was like, okay, like, I think the home birth is the way to go. And it took a while for my husband to get on board. He was actually okay with a freestanding birth clinic, but not a home birth. And I just had to sit him down, and I'm like, there's no more safety precautions at a freestanding birth clinic than there is at a home birth, because your midwife brings the oxygen and the suction. And actually, in a lot of times it's safer, because you have more freedom of like what hospital you're going to. You're not bound by that particular midwife or the practice of the birth center itself. So we met with our Cheryl midwife, our midwife Cheryl, and I just like immediately kind of felt at peace. And she's like, okay, well, if you're a VBAC mama, like I want you to read and understand risk, and not in a scary or negative way, but just to be well informed. And I really liked that, and it was amazing going in for a prenatal appointment. I was like, instead of like the 5 minutes you get with your OB, like her appointments were 30 minutes to an hour long, and they were about nutrition and exercising, and she taught me like stretches to do for around ligament pain, and like it was just so much more holistic than like here's your height and weight and like let's listen to the baby, like there was just that was part of it too, but it just was that was not the end of the care that you got. And so when we went for our 20-week ultrasound, we noticed, they did the anatomy scan, and then we kind of got stuck on the placenta. And one of the things that you worry about, especially with a C-section mama, is having placental accreta or having some kind of issues with where the placenta attaches close to the scar. And so I kind of like, during the ultrasound, I thought that that's what they were looking at, but it turns out I had this massive blood pool in my placenta, and it was probably from the twin that was getting reabsorbed back into my body, into the placenta, because I didn't have like a typical miscarriage where it was my body was reabsorbing that baby, but they didn't know for sure if that's what it was. So at 35 weeks, I had to go to a high risk fetal medicine doctor just to rule out the chance for accreta, which that's when the placenta grows through the uterus, and it can grow in different degrees, but it's a very risky situation. And so they were able to rule that out. So I was able to continue with the home birth path. And I think I mentioned that my daughter was born at 39 weeks. I thought it was going to be 41, but she was 39. So we're getting to 39 weeks. And I started having regular timing contractions Sunday. And I was like, all right, like we're going to have another 39 weeker. Like it's fine. We're ready. And so I called my midwife at 11:30 at night on Saturday evening. And she's like, okay, well, your contractions are about 5 minutes apart. Like take a bath, like get some sleep, and, call me if anything changes. But she's like, you're in very early labor still, like just go ahead and just try to relax as much as you can. So we did. I did not get any sleep that night. I laid down, but again, with contractions, I couldn't fall asleep. So I was up all night, and about 5:30, I was like, okay, I'm gonna have to call my midwife and tell her, like, I think this is the real deal. Contractions started spacing out a little bit, and they spaced out from like 3 minutes apart or 4 minutes apart. They never got below 4 minutes apart, to like 10 minutes apart, and then they were 15 minutes apart, and then they were done. And I was like, oh, well, I guess I'm not having a baby today. So that was really frustrating. But my husband was like, well, even though that's frustrating, think about it. If we would have went to the hospital, they would have probably been like, well, you're having a baby today, so we're going to put you on Pitocin, or they're going to do some kind of intervention, because generally, if your contractions are about 4 minutes apart, you're probably not leaving the hospital, at least in most hospitals. So I tried to like find peace with that, except for this happened about 4 more times the next week. Every night I went to bed, I had contractions, and every night they would fizzle out anywhere from 2 a.m. to 6 a.m. I had hit my due date, and I didn't even know what is it called, the prodromal labor.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I didn't even know that was a thing until I had it, and I was like, this is awful. And so labor is just so much of a mental game as it is a physical game. And I just couldn't wrap my mind around it. And I really was like, maybe we should just go to the hospital and get induced at this point. Like, I just, you hit that exhaustion. Like, I think I had slept like maybe 10 hours in the last week. And I am not exaggerating. Like, it was awful. I just was barely functioning. I had a little toddler running around. She was almost 3 at the time. And I just was like, I can't do this. And so thankfully the next couple nights were quiet. And then again, I went to bed at like 10 o'clock. I woke up at 10:30, whopping 30 minutes of sleep. And I was like, all right, we're going to have another night of contractions. Hopefully we have a baby at the end of this one, because I don't know if I can handle them spacing back out. Like, I just was like, I just don't think I can handle it this time. And so I got up, I was on the birth bowl, I was taking a shower, I was sitting backwards on the toilet, like, just really, just trying to breathe through every contraction. About 12:45, I wake up my husband. I was like, all right, I've got really bad back labor again. You're going to have to give me that counter pressure. So he did. And we kind of talked and breathed through the contractions for about 30 minutes. And we called my midwife at, I don't know, 1:15, 1:30 in the morning. And so she was listening to my contractions on the phone. She's like, all right, I'm going to get my stuff packed up and I'll be heading your way shortly. So I'm like, okay, great. Like, maybe tonight we're going to have a baby. And my husband decided to call our in-laws, which we had not talked about this. And so they showed up at our house. They live about an hour away, so they didn't show up right away. And by then my midwife was already there and kind of like setting stuff up. And my in-laws showed up, and I was not quite ready for that, because they did know we were having a home birth. And my father-in-law is an MD and was not very supportive of it. And we, kind of like you, we kept it really on the down low, just because I was comfortable with the decision we were making, but I didn't need to hear everyone's horror story. And I didn't know a lot of women who had home births. So that was another thing, like, there wasn't someone that I could like talk to about it. And so they came, and my husband immediately was like, okay, I guess you're going upstairs. Cause I was like, I don't want anyone else around. Like, I'm laboring. And so about 3:30, I had hit a wall, and I was just like, are we really doing the right thing having a home birth? And my midwife's like, you're getting close. And I'm like, I've got 12 hours of labor at least ahead of me before, I'd have a baby. So she's like, no, just take it one contraction at a time. And she checked me. That was the only time I got checked that, and I was 6. And I was like, okay, like, this isn't terrible. And so I kept laboring. And then I asked for the birth pool to get full or filled up. And she's like, well, let's wait a little bit longer. And I'm like, okay, fine. So we waited a little bit. And then at 4 o'clock, she was like, okay, you can go ahead and get in the birth pool now. And little did I know, my midwife always has a second midwife come when you're in transition delivery, or she tries to. And so all of a sudden I saw the second midwife there, and I was like, whoa, my midwife thinks I'm much further along than I think I am. So I was like, that's a good thing. And for those moms out there, I can tell you, at least for me personally, once I get into the birth pool and kind of just like submerge my body, like, the pressure and the contractions are just substantially lower. And it was just like the new confidence I needed to, like, all right, we can have this baby. Like, we can, I can do this. And so by 4:30, I was ready to start pushing. And I just told my midwife, and I was like, okay, I think I need to push. And she's like, great, do it. And I was like, what? You don't need to check me? You don't need it. She's like, no, your body knows what's doing. You're just listen to your body. So it was just very different than like hitting that transition when I'm in a birth pool at home. There was the 2 midwives, there was my husband, that was it. There was no bazillion doctors in the room. There was no bright lights. It was just the 3 of us. And so I get in, I start pushing, and I feel rejuvenated, like, okay, we can do this. And then all of a sudden my hands and my face turned numb. And that's the same thing that had happened with my first. And I was like petrified that all of a sudden, oh no, something's wrong. And Then I started throwing up and my midwife's like, that's just probably how your body handles transition. Like, don't fight it. Like, just breathe through it. And the second midwife kind of jumps in. She's like, I'll help you breathe. So just focus with the contractions and just push your baby out. And that's what we did. The first contraction, my water broke. And it was probably the most vivid memory outside of my son being born was just that pressure, my water breaking. And then the next contraction, I was like, oh no, I tore. And they're checking with their mirrors. And I mean, it's like pitch black in my room. So I don't know how they saw anything. I know they had lights and stuff, but from my perspective, it was 4:30 in the morning. So they checked and they're like, no, you didn't tear. And within a few more pushes, he was here. And he actually had the hiccups while crowning, which is not a fun feeling. But I think it was like God's way telling me like he's okay, he's breathing, like he's getting the oxygen he needs, his body's fine, And so I was able to push him out and brought him right to my chest. And I just got to sit there and hold him and love on him. And, I didn't have anyone trying to like take measurements. Like my midwife, was doing APGAR scores. I mean, very standard. But it was just done in a way that like respected me and respected my baby. It was just so peaceful. It was just such an amazing experience to have that. So we were in the pool for probably about 15 minutes and then I delivered my placenta. There was some concern with the amount I was bleeding. So I had to get out of the tub probably faster than what most home births are, sometimes 15, 30 minutes. So I got out, I got to the bed and it was just like, I got to hold him. And my husband got to like sit next to me. Like there's no one telling you, no, you can't do something or, it was just like, it's just like what we like needed and wanted. And it was so healing. But the one thing is, and I forgot to mention, my first daughter, she was very tiny. She was 6 pounds. My second baby was 9.5 pounds. So I was like, God, you got those two backwards. So I actually tore very significantly with my son, and his birth was as peaceful as could be, but the recovery actually was very, very hard. The recovery of his birth was probably harder than my C-section in terms of like the physical aspect. But again, having that emotional aspect of like his peaceful birth, like it's like I had the ability to deal with the physical pain of it. But when it came time for our next baby, I really was like, I don't know if I want another vaginal birth. I'll be honest, I did not expect to be harder. But so we definitely, my husband and I went back and forth, what we wanted to do. And part of it was I had to meet with a couple plastic surgeons and they recommended against having a vaginal birth. And so it wasn't just like don't do it type thing. So with all of that, my husband and I were like, okay, well, let's talk to our midwife again.
Did your midwives ever give any insight into maybe why you had torn so bad, or was there anything that happened that could have
So he descended very quickly. And so I actually, and this is probably important. So I felt my water break, and I do think that next one, I think I did tear, but it was a vaginal tear. And those are pretty rare in birth. Mostly it's your perineum that tears. Sometimes you have some sideways tearing, but again, that's not as common. And so I had a 7-inch vaginal tear, and then it was probably because he descended so fast, he kind of landed on my bone and it just split the skin and muscle actually. And then I had a 3rd degree perineal tear and I had labial tears. I have no idea why it was so bad. Now I was kind of in a semi-reclined position for delivering him, which probably exacerbated the tears. And while all this, I had to meet with a plastic surgeon and this and that, my midwife did suture me up, but she missed my vaginal tear. And so I was pretty upset that was missed. And then when I was going to the different specialists, he's like, oh, well, it's usually missed like 50% of the time when you're in stirrups. And I was like, oh, okay. So it's not necessarily, it wasn't my midwife's fault necessarily, if that makes sense. And since I had such extensive tearing externally as well, it made sense. They're like, oh, well, your pain is because of this, even though that there was still a lot more that happened. And it's, it's also hard too because you just had a baby. So that site where the placenta is bleeding. So, and so probably a lot of the blood loss was not from my placental site. It was probably from the vaginal tear itself. It was the muscle bleeding. But again, that's masked, and it's just a harder situation. And so I did a lot of pelvic PT after that. I never thought I would have another child for a while. Then in that time, my husband actually got diagnosed with epilepsy. He had had a couple grand mal seizures, and so he couldn't drive anymore. And I went for a well woman, and there was some precancerous cell that the backing OB who backs my midwife was kind of worried about. And she's like, well, if you want another baby, like you should try now. And I was like, oh, my baby's only like one, I don't, 1.5. And we just didn't know if we were ready for another baby, but we didn't really want just 2 kids. So we're like, all right, I guess if it's now or never, like we'll do it, So, and we got pregnant very easily that time. So we didn't need Clomid or any of those other fertility aids, I guess. So we get pregnant, and then actually a couple months later, my husband has brain surgery, and we had purposely scheduled his surgery. So I'd be in my second trimester in case I was really sick again, that I would have my energy to take care of him while he recovered. And so as you can see, the timing just was not ideal in our books. But and then we get a call that the surgery that my husband was going to have was getting suspended in the nation because of like certain MRIs that had to be done during the surgery itself. And so his surgery got moved up 2 months. So I went from like expecting him to have surgery when I'm like 20 weeks, it was like 10. And we hadn't even told anybody yet that we were expecting. And so now I'm sitting in an OR waiting room with my in-laws for like 12 hours. And I'm trying not to throw up because they didn't know I was pregnant. And I was like, I probably should have just told them. But I didn't want to tell them without my husband. And anyways, so I had gotten the green light from my OV to have another vaginal birth. And she's like, if you want to have another home birth, have another home birth. Like, she's like, the tearing's not going to be as extensive the second time. And I was still pretty nervous. And so my midwife, every single appointment, she was like, okay, let's talk about birth positions. Let's talk about like different things you can do, different herbs and supplements to help elasticity. And so it really helped me feel comfortable. And it also, I was like, I'm gonna be honest, like you're gonna have to tell me like you need to not be in that position. I don't care if you want to, because I was like, I need to be okay with someone, being a little bit more pushy, because I was like, this is something that's important to me, and in the moment I don't know like what my mental state's gonna be. And so she agreed that she would do it. And so I felt pretty good about that. And going into that home birth was good. Again, I had the huge prenatal labor for about 2 weeks again. And it's mentally exhausting to be in labor almost every single night, and then just to have it fizzle out by morning and you're not sleeping. And now I had 2 kids to take care of and 9 months pregnant. And
had you done anything just for the emotional side? Like, I guess I just hear women sometimes talk about like emotional blocks in labor, like if they have a fear of tearing or pushing, or whatever it might be. Did you feel any of that going into this third labor, or did everything you were doing with your midwife kind of alleviate that?
I was afraid that it was still going to be that way. Like when it got to the point of pushing, that I'd be like, I don't want to do this. And so that that was a fear, but my husband and I had talked about it a lot. I was like, you're going to have to be a very big emotional cheerleader for me. And when I'm in the moment of birth, I don't really need a lot of external praise or external like affirmation. I just I internally go in, I know what I need to do. And I will say the thing I did read a little bit more was like Ina May, just reading other women's birth stories, and just trying to visually feel or see my baby come out, and so I would say I did a lot more of that in preparation for my daughter's birth. So we get to about 36, 38 weeks. My little girl's still breech. And I'm like at my wit's end because I've already had one breech baby. And I had an aunt who had a breech baby. So I'm like, I don't know, like maybe it's my anatomy. Maybe there's some kind of neurological thing that my babies don't know what's head down. Like I have no idea. Right. And so, but I'm just like, this baby's got to get head down. So I am doing all the spinning baby techniques. I had a booked appointment to go get external version, which a lot of OBs will not do on a C-section mama. Like that's just kind of a big no-no for a lot of them. And but my midwife's backing OB does it, and she actually does it in an office and not in an OR because she's like the baby whisperer. She can get babies to turn really easily, apparently. And she's just like, it's not this big aggressive thing. It doesn't have to be that. So we ended up not needing it, thankfully. My daughter turned the day before my appointment, but she didn't turn till 39 weeks. So I had all those emotions. Like we had been researching going to St. Louis, so it's about a 4-hour drive for us to deliver with a like 80-year-old OB there who does breech delivery because he was trained to do breech delivery. Like that's just not something that's taught anymore. So I was like, trying to look at all the different options. But she turned and we had another beautiful home birth. Hers was a little bit different. I went into labor about 3 a.m. So I didn't quite start at 11 like the rest of my other two. So I actually got a full night's sleep. I got about 6 hours of sleep. That's a full night for a mom. So I got about 6 hours of sleep and I wake up and I'm having pretty steady contractions at that point. I wake up my husband about 4:30 and again I had back labor, so I was like, all right, I need you to like push on my back. And so he much obliged. And then I called my midwife at 6:30 in the morning and I was like, so I'm gonna have a baby today. I don't need you right now, but I need you to find a ride for your daughter to school, because if my midwife would have taken her daughter to school, it would have been probably about an hour and a half process, just like driving her to school 30 minutes away, driving back home, and because the midwife lived about 30 minutes away. And so she was just like, you're such a mom. Like, I'm worried about my midwife's kids getting to school on time. So she ended up coming much sooner than she normally would have, because she could just hear in my voice that she thought I was pretty close to having a baby. And so she gets in my house around 7 a.m. And my daughter, we had the two kiddos at the time. My daughter was 5, and she was going to be in the room when the baby was born. That was something that we had discussed, and she really wanted to be. And we watched a lot of birth videos with her, so she was prepared for it. And so about 8:30 we started filling up the birth tub, and the second midwife shows up, and like that was my trigger. I was like, all right, this baby's getting close, like, and I didn't quite hit a brick wall this time, so I'm feeling good. I get in the birth tub and I went 45 minutes without a contraction. And so the midwife's like, you got to get out, like maybe the water just slowed you down too much, which actually can happen. And so I was just like, oh my gosh, my mom's here. I've got 2 midwives and a birth assistant in training was there. And I'm like, like I felt like I just kind of had let them all down, and she's like, it's fine. And so my midwife suggests, she's like, why don't you just go back in your bedroom with your husband and close the door and just pretend nobody else is here. And if we all have to leave because you stop labor, it's not a big deal. And I'm 41 weeks at this point. So like I needed to have the baby sooner rather than later. And so I would say once I got out of the birth pool, that was about 9:30 or so, contractions started picking up, but they weren't consistent. So some contractions were like coming every 5 minutes apart. Sometimes they were 3 minutes apart. Sometimes they were 10 minutes apart. And then the lengths were just as crazy, and the intensities. I mean, it was just like I like had to stop. I had to put my contraction timer away because I was so like emotionally like, oh my gosh, like I'm not in active labor, like they're spacing back out. And she's like, just have your contractions, like just think about the contraction. But it was very mentally draining because I never knew when a contraction was going to come, and I never knew how hard it was going to be. So I might have a 30-second putz contraction followed by a 2-minute transition contraction, and it was awful. And I was like, when am I going to know when to get back in the pool? And she's like, well, you might not be getting it back into the pool until you're pushing, like, because she just didn't want it to space back out. And then finally, a little bit after 11, I got back into the pool, and it was not very warm at that point, which I was kind of sad. And they had added boiling water, but it was just, they just didn't know when I was going to get back in. So they didn't want to keep it really hot. So I got in, and it still had that immediate, like, calming sensation for me. So I get in, and about 15 minutes later, I started pushing, and she was born about 15 minutes of pushing. So it was so much easier. Like once I got back into there, she was another 9-pound baby. And we had 0 tearing that time. So I was like night and day difference between my first and second VBAC. And I remember, so my daughter got to be there. So she got to help like pick the baby up and bring her to my chest, which was such a special moment, especially because my older daughter's birth had been kind of so rocky. And so it continued just to help with like the healing process of my first C-section. Again, it was really peaceful. It was a little bit more chaotic because my mother-in-law was there, and my mother, and there's just a lot more people.
Do you remember what position you were in when you pushed
Oh,
her out?
yes. So I was almost on hands and knees, kind of leaning over the back of or on the side of the birth pool. And so that worked amazing. It was a little bit more of a gymnastics to get the baby to my chest with the cord, but the midwives are super trained in that, so they're fine. But I was just like, oh, this is really weird. I just had a baby, and I'm like moving in these weird positions. But and bleeding wasn't as bad that time, so we got to have more quiet bonding time. And my midwife did. After the baby was born, even before the placenta, she was like, okay, everybody out of the room. So my midwife was very good at like intuitively knowing the needs, what I needed at that moment. Like I didn't need like, you saw the baby, great, like go away now. Like let me have that time with her, and that the time with my husband to nurse our baby, and just kind of like relish in the accomplishment of just having a baby. And so it was nice having just that quiet interaction, even though there was kind of a lot more people there for the birth itself. It just brought us back to nurse my baby and just really be in tune to her needs, and not what the 3-year-old wanted, or the one, like you add those kids, and it really is a huge blessing to have your older children present if they can, because I can tell you now, my daughter, now 7, does not fear birth. She thinks it's awesome, and I never had that, and so it's not this big scary thing for her. It's like, oh, just a natural thing of welcoming a baby. So that's really neat. So around 2 weeks, we noticed that My little squish had some hip popping, so we ended up having to get an ultrasound, and she had hip dysplasia. My older one had hip dysplasia, but we didn't find it right away. Again, that hospital disconnect. So she went into a hip brace right away, which was like so sad, but is not surprising with being as breech, because she was breech until about 38 weeks or something. So
Was she, you said your first was she Frank Breach?
yes, so they were both Frank breech. Yeah, and actually my oldest, so it's funny. I never really saw this because again, I was on the other side of the OR. But if anybody's seen a breech baby, like their legs are hilarious to look at. So my daughter's legs were straight up in the air because she was Frank breech. If you're a complete breech, your legs are, or your feet are almost by your ears, like you're folded in half. And so, yeah, so my oldest did have hip dysplasia, and her bottom was black and blue because she was sitting so low in the birth canal with the contractions. Like, the head can withstand those contractions a lot better than the bottom can. So my second daughter, my third child, ended up going into a hip brace around 2 months, I think, and then and just her whole birth was just so peaceful that even like it was frustrating she had to go into a hip brace, but I feel like emotionally I was just doing so much better. Like I felt great, and it's not to say that everything was easy, because it wasn't. Like having a baby is still hard. Recovering from childbirth is still hard, even if you don't tear and everything. It's just your body went through a lot and you need to rest. But I think just having such, that bonding, things like the hip brace wasn't as hard to deal with. I think if my oldest would have got put in a hip brace right away, like it would have been more it's the end of the world type thing, which it wouldn't have been, but just my perception of it at the time. So, and in that process, after my daughter was born, she was born in September. A few months later, my husband had another grand mal seizure. And so we were hoping that the brain surgery was going to fix that, and it didn't. So we had to become an epilepsy family again. So he couldn't drive, he couldn't watch the kids unless there was another adult. And when you have a newborn and you can't even get like a 30-minute break sometimes, like that was hard. And we decided in January of 2019 that we were going to move. And we decided to move into a neighborhood that's more of an intentional living. So we knew a couple of the families, but there's 13 families and 31 kids, and everyone plays outside and just like work hard to take care of each other. It's kind of like a built-in family. And so we decided to move. We rented for a year because my husband had to have a couple of more surgeries, and so it was kind of this growing year for us as a family of three, and trying to figure out the epilepsy and moving and all that. And so we did that, and we just, I don't know, just decided that, life is short and why not be a really big family? And so in February of last year, it was not she's not a Super Bowl baby. So we're from Kansas City and they won. So, but
Just have to put that disclaimer out there.
I do. And it actually comes into play in the story too. So, so we're living in this great neighborhood, and, all of a sudden I'm like, all right, like, yeah, let's have another baby. Like, what? Sure, why not? So, we got pregnant in February, and, we missed the Super Bowl, we missed Valentine's Day, and we snuck it in before the pandemic shut the world down. And I actually found out our kids are so close in age. I actually didn't cycle between the two, but we were like, okay, like if we get pregnant, great. If we don't, great. Like it wasn't, one of those like actively trying and frustrated if you don't get pregnant right away. So, but we did. I found out on April Fool's Day that I was pregnant, I was talking to my friend who lives in Houston, and we had been like sheltering in place like over a month at this point. And I was just like, life is just really hard, like more than like pandemic hard, like nobody was sick or anything. And I was like, I just can't sleep. And she's like, are you stressed about the pandemic? And I was like, I mean, we're being careful, and she was like, the only other time you have really bad insomnia is when you're pregnant. Have you taken a pregnancy test? And I was like, I'm not pregnant. And I'm not pregnant. I would be throwing up if I'm pregnant, And so she was just kind of giving me a hard time. So she's like, go buy a pregnancy test. So I did. I took it at 4 a.m. because I had to take it with first morning urine. So anyways, find out blaring positive. Like it's the most positive test that I've ever had. And I was like, oh, I'm probably further along than I thought. So I told my husband, of course, it's April 1st, and he doesn't believe me. Like he's like, that's a bad joke. And I'm like, I'm not joking. And so I called my midwife. She's like, well, how far along are you? And I was like, oh, anywhere from like 3 to 16 weeks. Not really sure. She just was like, oh, okay, great. And because at the time she was really busy because the hospitals weren't allowing dads in. And so a lot of people were abruptly choosing home birth. And so I was like, I mean, it's going to be the fall, so we're fine, right? And she was like, and I had stuck with the same midwife. So she's like, yes, you're fine. Like, so I find out that about 8 weeks pregnant, which was kind of a rock star to like get like half the first trimester over before you even know you're pregnant. But then like 2 days later, I started throwing up for the next 16 weeks. So, I mean, it really didn't matter. But I was joking with my neighbor at one point in the beginning of March, and I was like, it's just, she's like, how's it going? I was like, this week has been hard with the kids. And now I like joke, and I was like, oh man, I was pregnant. I just didn't know it. I was so tired and sitting on the couch all day and all that, like first trimester low energy. And I was like, okay, well, that makes me feel better that I just wasn't being a lazy mom for a couple of weeks. Like I really, it was just hard, and that's okay. And so, with the pandemic, it made prenatal care a little bit more challenging. My midwife still allowed spouses and children, but she really encouraged you not to, just to reduce the number of exposures, and which I totally respect. And since, we had already had 2 home births at this point, my husband and I had decided that we weren't going to take any of the kids, and he wasn't going to come. So he didn't come to any prenatal appointments, which was kind of weird. He didn't get to come to the anatomy scan, so we chose not to find out the gender this time because he wasn't there. And which, it's just, it was unique times. But I would say like towards the end of it, when I delivered her, was actually the worst of the pandemic to date in our area. And so hospitals were closed. There was no visitors. The OB, like you could still have your partner, and some hospitals allowed doulas, but that was like a day-to-day by situation. So I was very thankful to have a home birth, but at the same time, for some reason, this pregnancy, I was having like a lot of dreams that I'm like, oh, there's a snowstorm and my midwife can't make it. Or like, I think it was just the anxiety from the pandemic itself, kind of like playing on my fears a little bit. I'm like, oh my gosh, like what happens if I get transferred, and like what if there's no beds? And because some of the hospitals were at capacity, they couldn't take people and they were turning away ambulances. And so I had been vocalizing this to my midwife, and and she's like, you've had 2 VBACs at home. She's like, hospitals will take moms in an emergency. Like that's not like the OB wards are not overflowing. And we were joking at my 40-week appointment, because I made it to 40 weeks this time. And she's like, well, I think all the Super Bowl babies have been born, so I think we're good now. Like the spike in births have happened, mostly. And so I was like, okay, like the OB wards aren't full, like we'll be fine. And again, I had the prenatal labor. This was Tuesday. I had some like outdoor, it was nice in November. So a couple of my neighbors, we had got outside and just chatting, our 6 feet apart, mask, and I was like, okay, it's like 9:30, like I should be getting to going to bed in case I have a baby. And one of the moms who, so we moved into this neighborhood. Two of the moms in this neighborhood of 13 families had home births with the same midwife. Like, I didn't know them before. So it was just kind of like, whoa, that's weird. Like, I mean, there's like 10 home birth midwives here, but and so she was like, I'll walk you home. I just don't think you should be walking home by yourself. And I was like, okay, fine, whatever. So she walks me home. I start throwing up on the way home and I start having intense contractions. And I'm like, oh, okay, well, maybe we'll have a baby tonight. Like, I was already past my due date at this point. So I'm like, okay, that's fine. Like, we can have a baby tonight. So, and again, like, it's pretty normal for me to go into labor around 10 o'clock at night and have a baby. So I get home. My husband's like, you look awful. And I was like, don't tell a pregnant woman she looks awful. Like, I'm probably in labor. And he's like, great. So I go and I take a shower, trying to like do my like normal calming things, like, picked up my bedroom a little bit. So if there would be, cute baby pictures, I, wouldn't have a pile of dirty laundry over on the side or, like whatever I thought was important at the moment. And so again, I labored all overnight. And I had texted my midwife, or I didn't text my midwife because I was like, oh, it's already 10:45. Like, I'll just call her if I need her. Like, I'm not going to text her because she now lives 5 minutes away instead of 30 minutes away. So I was like, I'll just call her when I need her. I get to 5:30 in the morning. And I'm like, all right, 2 more contractions. If I have 2 more contractions, I'm going to get up and shower again. I had 1 more contraction and then that next contraction didn't come. So I was like, again, just frustrated that I had been in labor for like almost 7 hours, like timeable under 5 minutes, like hard contractions. And I was just so frustrated that once again, my babies are like, nope, that's just how labor works for me. I think that happened one more time before the real deal. It wasn't as intense, and I kind of just like stopped like acknowledging the fact that I might have a baby. Like, I was, and so that Sunday, so I'm 41 weeks at this point, which is the longest I had gone, and everybody in my neighborhood, for such a tight knit neighborhood, they're all like, is this baby coming? This baby? I'm like, no, this baby's not coming for a week. It's fine. And our church actually got shut down because usually I would go to church early on Sunday morning, but the pastor got COVID, so it was shut down. So it was just kind of this like lazy morning, and I had a couple strong contractions around like 8 or 9, and my husband's like, oh, maybe we'll have a baby. And I was like, we're not having a baby today. Like, stop saying that. Like, and he's like, okay, we're not having a baby today. Fine. And so about like 9 o'clock, I like get out of bed, which is rare for me. My kids get me up before 6. So I was well rested, and I was like, oh, I'm going to go for a walk, and just kind of like did some small stuff around the house. Then about 11:30, I'm like, okay, like I could tell I was just like getting agitated, but I wasn't even having contractions. So my husband had asked me to like make lunch for the kids, and I like go to start making lunch, and I'm like, I can't do this. Like, this smells gross. Like, I was like, I'm just gonna go for a walk again. Like, that was like my like go-to. Like, I just need to get out of the house. I'm just gonna go for a walk real quickly. So I go on this walk, like maybe a mile walk, and it was just like every step was painful. Like, just like I was not having contractions, but I was like, why is this taking so much energy? And I was kind of beside myself. I was like, this should be like this nice, peaceful walk. I don't have 2 toddlers like talking to me incessantly. Like, I was like, this is my reprieve. What is going on? So I think I had like 1 contraction during that walk, and I was just like, I don't know, maybe I'll have a baby in the next like 2 days or something. But I was like, come on, like, I've never been 41 weeks. This is awful. Like, let's just get this show on the road. So I get home. I try to put my 2-year-old to bed for a nap. It's about, I don't know, noon or something. And I had noticed that I had a couple contractions. I was like, okay, like, I was trying really hard not to time them. And then I think by like 1 o'clock, I started timing them, and I was like, okay, well, they're like 7 minutes apart. And then I had a couple that were 5 minutes apart. And I was like, okay, well, maybe this is the real deal. Probably not. So I just told my husband, I was like, why don't you just set up the birth pool and the plastic liner on the bed or whatever, But I was like, don't get excited because we're probably not having a baby for like at least 2 days. And he's like, okay. So he sets up the birth pool, and I decide to go take a bath, and he's like, we have a problem. And I was like, you're not allowed to say that. So he's like, this birth pool has a hole in it. It wouldn't stay inflated. And he's like, maybe we can duct tape it. I'm like, this birth pool is going on the second story of our house. Like, we're not like duct taping and putting like tons of water in it, because if it breaks, like, I don't want ceilings and floor, like, that's just the mom thing. I'm like, that's just thousands of dollars of damage. Like, I was like, okay. So I was like, call my midwife. She lives 5 minutes away now. And so my husband calls her, and she's like, I don't have any more birth pools. Like, she has 10 birth pools, and she's like, I don't have any. They're all loaned out. She's like, I'm waiting on a lot of moms. She's like, I've got that Super Bowl and that that Valentine baby like rush is coming. And I was like, but I need my birth pool. Like, I mean, I was just like, so I was kind of beside myself. And she's like, I'll see what I can do. And I was like, oh, please, like, let someone have a birth pool. Like, that has been my saving grace the last 2 births. And so I don't know, but she ended up finding one. Again, she lived 5 minutes away. So this was like at 1:30. She comes and drops it off. And she was going to come in and talk to me, but my husband's like, all right, thanks. Like, and so she's like, oh, maybe it's not really that urgent. Like, okay, that's fine. Like, my midwife she's like, that was kind of weird, but whatever. And again, she lives 5 minutes away. So she went home, and then I was like, okay, he starts filling it up, and I was like, man, I really want to get in that birth pool right now. And he's like, if you get in there, you're not going to have contractions. So he's like, you're not allowed to get in that. And my midwife actually made that point. She's like, Linda is not allowed to get into the water until I'm there. And that's a pretty standard practice, I think, for a lot of midwives. And so I was like, fine, I'll just go take another bath. So this is about 2:00. I have 3 kids like running in and out of the bathroom and my room, and the toddler never took a nap. Like, it's just like, it's batty in my house. I don't even know where my midwife or where my husband was, but I remember thinking, I'm like, I'm going to have this baby by myself. Like, this is like 2020, right? Like, I'm going to have an unintended, unassisted delivery, and my husband's going to be in the other room. Like, this is how ridiculous it's going to be. But then, and then I'm like, still not in labor. Like, I was like having contractions like every 5 minutes. So I had only been timing contractions for about an hour, and they were not consistent. They're still not consistent at this point. And then like at 2:15, I was like, I need my midwife and my husband now. So I like told my 7-year-old, I was like, go get daddy. I need Cheryl here now. And she's like, okay, mom. And so my husband is talking to the midwife, and she can hear me like in the other room, like with a contraction. She's like, I'm on my way. I'm dropping everything. And like I said, there was a couple other moms in the neighborhood that had home birth. So she had asked me before. So this was not breaking HIPAA or anything like that. But she's like, because I was having all of those dreams that everybody was going to miss my birth. She's like, what if I call this one mom? She has 7 kids. And she's like, so she can at least like walk over to your house and be with you. And I'm like, that's fine. Like, you can do that, and so that was agreed upon. And so my midwife's like throwing all of her stuff in the car, getting, over here. And she almost called this neighbor of mine to be like, you should probably just go check on her, because she might be having her baby. So my midwife gets here at like 2:30, 2:45. I don't even remember. And she walks into the bathroom. I'm still in the bathtub because I refuse to get out of water. And she's like, so do you want to have this baby on the bathtub or on the floor? And I said, I want my birth pool. Like, where's my birth pool? And she's like, oh, honey, we don't have time for that. And I was like, yeah, I've needed to push for like 5 minutes. Like, I'm waiting for this birth pool. And she's like, okay, well, do you want bathtub or the floor? And I And she's like, I really need you to seriously answer this. And I was like, I guess the bathtub, if it was safe enough, because you need enough water to make sure the baby doesn't come out and breathe and then go back under. So I was like, I was like, if you think there's enough water in this bathtub, and she's like, you'll be okay. And then she goes and checks the water. She's like, it's scalding hot, but there's enough water in the birth pool if you want to move to the birth pool. And I think I jumped out of that bathtub to get in the birth pool. I get in, and it's warm. It's pretty warm. And I was like, all right, I'm gonna push. And she's like, really? So my water broke. First push, my water broke. The second push, like not even 30 seconds later, and then the head was born. She had to stop me from pushing because just to check the cord and everything. And so yeah, the whole active labor was under 40 minutes, and pushing was 3 minutes. But thankfully, it was not an unassisted delivery. So yeah, I was so thankful. I mean, she was really worried on the way over. She's like, I just kept praying that you were not going to have that baby, because she's like, you thought that the whole pregnancy. And she's like, and little, I was so close to that actually happening. So the labor, or like, again, it was so beautiful. And it was a little chaotic just because like it was just my husband and her, and then my 7-year-old was in the room too, but she actually missed the head coming out, and she was like so sad. But I was like, sorry, we didn't know the baby was coming. Like, and I mean, she wasn't upset by it, but it was just like, oh man, like I missed it. But because of COVID, like my in-laws couldn't come, my mom couldn't come. I mean, there was nobody else in the house other than my kiddos and my midwife and my husband. Like that was it. So we didn't have any of that extra help because of COVID, and like that was hard. And also like my husband had another seizure, so he couldn't drive at this point. And so it just was like, just kind of compounded everything, like, oh, this is crazy. And one of our neighbors was going to come over and watch the 2 little ones. I didn't care if they were necessarily in the room. Like, it wasn't like I was trying to keep them out. It was just like, I just wanted someone else there. If something went wrong, we needed to transfer to the hospital, or, they couldn't handle it, or, like all the reasons you should have someone with your other kids while you're in labor. Anyways, so my husband was talking to him, and he's like, oh, I'll be over there in like 30 minutes. Well, the baby came in like 5. So, I mean, we didn't have our neighbor's help, it was fine, but it was just like, so once she was born and all the kids got to give her a kiss, and my midwife's again, like, out, like, go watch TV. I don't care. Like, just leave mom alone. So we did that. And, it was, I got a nurser right away, and it was a little different just because like it was the shock. Like, I honestly was like, I'm already holding my baby. Like, I thought I was like days away from this. Like, definitely didn't think I was an hour away from it. My husband and I are just trying to like soak up that time. Like, okay, like this did just happen. We have this daughter. So, just enjoying those sweet moments. And then my midwife is like, okay, I need you to get out, because I was bleeding a lot. And I was like, okay. So I had to like stand up and like do a dance to try to get like my placenta to detach, and it did. But she's like, you're still bleeding more than I want you to. So let's go ahead and transfer you to bed just so she can monitor a little bit more closely. So we did, and everything seemed fine. And the bleeding stopped. And we were the second midwife got there like 30 minutes after she was born, so she was able to, help do all the like newborn, weighing and measuring, and help clean up the birth pool and all that fun stuff. And then they made me a meal. Then I think about an hour and a half after she was born, they left, which I think that's been about the same for all my births, around an hour and a half, 2 hours. So, meanwhile, all my older kids are gone at this point. They went over to the neighbor's house. And so it was just like my husband and I were like, we've never been just the 2 of us, like a year. Like, this is like crazy. And so then one of our neighbors surprised us with dinner. So she brought us dinner over, which was just like super sweet. And just it was just like this, like, really sweet little thing. Right after dinner, I was like, oh man, I don't feel so good. My husband's like, oh, what's wrong? And I was like, I kind of feel like I'm going to pass out. And I was still laying in bed. So I didn't get up. And all of a sudden I had like the tunnel vision and like ringing in my ears. And I was like, I'm going to pass out. Like, I wonder why. So I was able to like ward off passing out. And then my midwife's like, okay, well, you always need to try to empty your bladder if you think you're bleeding a lot, just because that can help facilitate a contraction. So about 30 minutes later, I'm like, okay, I feel okay. Like I went over to the edge of the bed and I sat there for a while. Then I walked to the bathroom. And when I did, I turned around and looked, and there was blood everywhere. And I was like, oh, this is not a good situation. So I went to the bathroom, and we had smelling salts, just in case you do pass out. So like, I mean, we were taking all of our like necessary steps that your midwife instructs you to do. And so I went to the bathroom, and I could just hear the blood pouring into the toilet. I was like, okay, this is not good. So I promptly put myself on the bathroom floor. So just in case I did pass out, I didn't feel like I was going to pass out, but I was like, okay, I'm losing too much blood. My husband and I were kind of like talking about like what order to call people, if that makes sense. Our next door neighbor, or she lives a couple houses down, she was an ER nurse. So I was like, let's get her over, because in that time I started like shaking, but like I was like jutting sideways, and I thought maybe I was having a stroke or a seizure. Again, my husband has epilepsy, so seizures are on my mind a little bit. And so I was like, okay, something's not right here. So we called our neighbor, and then my husband called our midwife, and she's like, I'm at another birth. I can't come to you, which was like understandable, but at the same time, it was like, oh, dang it. So we ended up calling the ambulance. By that time, when the ambulance got there, I was completely laying on the floor, and my neighbor, that's a nurse, she was like massaging my uterus, but she said I was like completely white, and she was like, you need to go to the hospital. And so we were getting loaded up to go, but because of COVID, the baby couldn't come with me. My husband couldn't come with me. And so, but they're like, oh, well, if we go to this one hospital, they're still allowing visitors, so you might be able to get in there. And so I'm like, all right, like that was not the hospital we were going to go to in the case of a transfer, but I was like, all right, COVID rules, like everything's off, like let's just go there. So when I was laying on the floor, my nurse friend, she's like, what do you need? And I said, I need someone to keep my baby warm, because I know my husband's not gonna, like, that's just not like a dad thing, right? Like moms are like skin to skin, like dads are like, oh baby, So I was like, I need someone to keep my baby warm. And I was like, I need food. Like I'm baby's food. Like I don't have formula in the house. I don't. And so she's like, all right, I'll figure it out. And so I left in the ambulance, and my nurse friend is trying to facilitate everything, because my husband can't drive. So they're trying to like pack up my husband and the baby, and to make sure that they had a ride to the hospital. And another neighbor came over, and she's about my age, and so she was like, strip, like, and so she put that baby skin to skin on another neighbor to keep her warm. And another mom, the one that had a home birth, like her baby was 1, so she like brings this like little 2 ounces of milk to like, here's some milk for your baby. It's just like everyone was just so fast to think of like how to help us, which was amazing. Like I, in the COVID world, I thought we were going to get zero help, and just how quickly when we needed it, it was there. So we get to the hospital, and I'm pretty nervous on the way. Like I was starting to feel a little bit better. Like all my mental faculties were there. I wasn't unconscious at this point, but I get up, and they tell us, they're like, okay, we're going to bypass you for the ER because of COVID, and we're just going to take you straight up to labor and delivery. So I was kind of like, okay, that's good, right? That's good. But they told me in the ER, or in the ambulance, they're like, you need a DNC and a blood transfusion, because of just the amount of blood that I had lost. And so I was, trying to emotionally prepare for that. And again, I didn't have my baby, and I didn't know when I would see her next or see my husband next. So we get there, and I'm kind of getting ready for like the hounding of questions, like, you had a home birth, like you're crazy. And I didn't get any of that. They were like, oh, okay, like your baby's 4 hours old. And so it was like 180 of like what I expected the perception of being a home mom or a home birth transfer to what it was. And so I was very, very happy about that, because I felt like I got better care. I didn't have boxing gloves on, right? Like I didn't have to defend my choices. They're like, oh, okay, great. And so, but the thing is I didn't think about this. And being a VBAC mama, like I thought about VBAC so much my first home birth. But my second home birth, like I didn't think about it at all. It wasn't until my midwife's like, oh, congratulations, you had a VBAC. And I was like, oh yeah, I did, didn't I? Like it wasn't that hounding thing that I constantly thought about. And so when I get to the hospital, because of bleeding, one of the things that they'll give you is Cytotec or Pitocin. Well, you can't have Cytotec if you've had a C-section. And so they were like, okay, we're going to give you Cytotec. And I was like, I don't think I can have that. I've had a C-section. They're like, what? You're a VBAC and you didn't tell us? And I was like, didn't even think about it, and I felt bad. I wasn't trying to withhold information. I just like that never crossed my mind. Like, oh yeah, she's another VBAC baby kind of thing. And so it turns out that when you have precipitous labor, your chance of hemorrhaging is substantially higher, just because the uterus doesn't fully contract back down. Well, anyways, I ended up having like a blood clot the size of a football that had developed like since after my midwife left. And I was still doing uterine massages, but I was not doing it as aggressively as they were. Let's just put it that way. And so once they were able to get that blood clot out and get a couple bags of Pitocin, I ended up being fine. I didn't need a DNC and a blood transfusion, thankfully. But when all this is happening, my mom is 3 hours away, and she calls like crying, and she's like, oh, are you okay? And, just asking all the questions. And she's like, well, do you feel like you made a wrong choice in having a home birth? And I said, no, I needed a little bit extra help. And so I went and got it. Like if you hemorrhaged in a hospital, people wouldn't think less of you or less of your birth if you needed a DNC or a blood transfusion or Pitocin post baby, or like, that's just like, people wouldn't even think about that. But I feel like with a home birth, that just like opens you up to be like, oh, well, you did that wrong, or you did that wrong. And later when I saw my family, my sister-in-law is an MD. And my mother-in-law was kind of asking me some questions like, oh, would you do another home birth, or what happened? Like, why were you bleeding so much? Like, and I don't know if they were meaning it to be accusatory or anything. I couldn't tell by their tone, and I'm not going to assume that. But my sister-in-law pipes in. She's like, well, when you have precipitous labor, you're probably going to have like more blood loss, maybe not substantial enough, but she's like, that's really common. Like, that wasn't anything our midwife did or didn't do. And, but to me, it actually, instead of scared me away from having a home birth, in fact, it did the opposite. It was like, when there's a medical need, like, you transfer and you get help. Like, I'm not going to die by my sword of having a home birth. Was I annoyed that I had to go to the hospital? Sure. Like, I would have much rather have not had to go, but I needed to, and I'm not sad by it, and so it's what was in the best interest of me and my baby. So, and I always told my husband from the beginning, back before we even had our first home birth, I was like, if we have to get transferred out because I risk out, or baby's breech, or whatever the reason, right? Then I'm going to have a baby in that, in the safest place possible. I believe that's at home for the vast majority of low risk women, but it's not for everybody. And it's okay that it's not for everybody, as long as they honestly assess their risk, then they can make the best decision for where to birth their babies.
Absolutely. So then how has the rest of this postpartum time been for you just after all of that?
I actually feel like this was probably one of the harder ones, probably because of blood loss was part of it. Again, the pandemic, not having like my mom here for a week to help me. And so, yeah, it was about a week after she was born. I called my neighbor. She actually, the ER nurse, she brought me dinner. I did have tons of meals. Thank you, neighborhood. So, but my ER nurse friend came over and because I was like, can you just check my blood pressure? Because I was actually concerned too that my blood pressure was high, and I've never had blood pressure issues, but they think it was the Pitocin that caused my blood pressure to be high. Anyways, but I just felt off, and I was still like nervous about having strokes or whatever. And it's just like, when you ever think that something's wrong, like check your blood pressure, like do fetal kit counts if you're still pregnant, obviously, or like there are certain like really low intervention things you can do to like assess risk. And so my blood pressure was a little high a week after. And my nurse friend's like, you need help. Like, you've got 4 kids now, all under the age of 7, and it's a pandemic. Like, it's winter, you can't go outside. And, so she was like, I really think you need to call like my mom or my in-laws to come take the older kids. And they did. And just having like 48 hours with just my husband and then this little squishy here was what I needed. And so I think there definitely can be challenges, at different phases in life, whether it's your first kid or 5th kid or 12th kid, and then, the pandemic definitely adds a layer of difficulty.
And regardless of the situation, having support or people that you can call is a big thing. It's important. Because you're right, you have to be able to take that time and take care of yourself to be able to take care of your family and your other children.
And I know the first day my husband had actually gone back to work, so he only had a week off this time. And he was like, are you just going to sit on the couch all day and nurse? And I'm like, that's exactly what I'm going to do.
That's exactly what you should do.
Right, exactly. But, it's just like, I don't have to make meals for other kids or, like address who has fighting over more magnetiles or goodness knows what's going on. But that's the thing. Like, it's just when you now have several kids, it is harder just to sit in bed for a week or two and just relish in the new baby greatness. And there was also a big emotional component too. And it's not only so much not getting help from like my in-laws or my family, but it's like they don't get that time with their grandchild either, and so like that was really hard for me. I was like, I love snuggling my baby, but I'm okay letting someone else snuggle them for 10 minutes while I take a shower or whatever. And that wasn't there, and I think grandparents are just so important. And so that was really hard to be like, I see you come, but you can't hold my baby. Like that was like, they never attacked me for it or anything, but I just like, it was very hard for me to like, be like, you can't hold your brand new baby, your grandbaby, so that was an emotional aspect that I did not realize would be so hard for me in 2020.
Yeah. So my only other question is just for any moms who are maybe exploring the option of home birth or trying to decide whether or not they want to go back to having a VBAC in the hospital or choosing to do it at home. Do you have any advice or anything that you've learned just from all of your experiences that you would want to pass on?
I think one of the big things is not making a decision out of fear. Do your research and know your risk and being confident in the decision that you make. Because labor and pregnancy, you're going to second guess yourself all the time, like anyways. But if you really have made a decision out of fear, I feel like that's going to negatively impact your ability to birth your baby in whatever environment you choose.
Absolutely.
That would be my tidbit.
Well, thank
the female
you.
body's amazing. You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Home Birth After Cesarean podcast. Make sure to subscribe, leave a rating, and follow us on Facebook and Instagram. If you're interested in sharing your home birth after cesarean story, send us an email at hbacpodcast@gmail.com. See you next week.